History is full of bizarre exits, but some deaths take absurdity to a whole new level. From the bisected balloon-loving priest to a man who volunteered to be eaten by a cannibal. And then there's the woman who suffered a fatal accident chasing a free game console. Some are darkly hilarious, some are horrifying, and some will leave you speechless. These are the weirdest ways to die. Let's start with one of the earliest weird deaths ever recorded. Aeschylus was an ancient Greek playwright and often considered the father of the Greek tragedy. Some of his most famous works include the Orestia, Prometheus Bound, and Seven Against Thebes. But ironically, though he was a master of tragedy, Aeschylus' death definitely wouldn't feel out of place in a comedy. In 456 BC, he was visiting the city of Gela, and he was walking outside when an eagle flying overhead dropped a tortoise on his head, which killed him. Already pretty funny, but here's the kicker. According to Pliny, Aeschylus had been trying to stay outdoors as much as he could at the time due to receiving a prophecy that he would be killed by a falling object. Someone give that prophet a raise. Here's a weird death that really checks all the boxes. A weird person who died doing something weird and left behind a weird corpse. Adelir Antonio de Carli, a Catholic priest from the city of Paranaguá, Brazil, died in a freak cluster ballooning accident. Cluster ballooning, by the way, is exactly what it sounds like, wearing a harness attached to a bunch of helium balloons and taking off like you're the house from Up. De Carli had been ordained in 2003 and quickly earned a reputation for being a bit of a maverick. He often came into contact with the Paranaguá Municipal Guard over their poor treatment of the city's homeless population. In 2008, De Carli was attempting to break the 19-hour flight record for cluster ballooning as a way of raising money for his charitable project, the Pastoral Rodoviaria, a spiritual rest stop created to bring the word of God to the many truckers who pass through the busy port city. After a successful trial flight, De Carli packed 5 days' worth of food and water, and he took off, wearing a thermal flight suit and sitting in a chair tied to 1,000 balloons. His goal was to fly to his brother's hometown, which would take 20 hours, but after the wind blew him out over the sea, he lost contact. The Navy and the Air Force were called in to search for him, but he had seemingly vanished. The search for De Carli was called off after a month. Then in July of that year, De Carli's lower half was found floating in the ocean by workers on an oil rig off the coast of Macaya. It's still unclear what happened to his upper half. Another mysterious death wasn't because of the death itself, but rather the effect that the death had on the people who witnessed it. In 1994, a woman named Gloria Ramirez was admitted to the hospital in Riverside, California, due to suffering late-stage cervical cancer. While medical workers tried to defibrillate Ramirez's heart, they noticed an oily sheen to her skin and a garlic-like smell coming from her mouth. A nurse took her blood and found that it smelled like ammonia and had strange yellowish particles floating in it. Both of the nurses who handled Ramirez's blood ended up fainting, with a third fainting as well after smelling the blood sample. 20 more people complained of feeling sick after coming into contact with Gloria Ramirez. Fearing some kind of contamination, most of the hospital staff were evacuated to the parking lot, while a skeleton crew stayed inside to try to stabilize Ramirez's condition. Unfortunately, they were unable to, and she ultimately died of kidney failure. But how did that cause 23 people to suddenly fall ill? The leading theory is that Ramirez had been self-medicating her cancer symptoms with a product called dimethyl sulfoxide, a commercially available topical pain treatment. When exposed to the oxygen from the mask that she was given by paramedics and the electricity from the defibrillator, the dimethyl sulfoxide was converted into a highly toxic gas called dimethyl sulfate. This next one will probably feel familiar to horror fans. In 2004, Francis Daniel Brom of Georgia, USA, was riding in a car with his friend, John Hutcherson, who had been drinking. At some point, Brom leaned his head out of the window for some fresh air and to feel that cool breeze in his hair. Unfortunately, Hutcherson lost control of the vehicle and it sideswiped a telephone pole support wire, which knocked Brom's head clean off. Hutcherson was so shocked that he parked the car at home and left Brom's headless body inside, too stunned to move it. A neighbor passing by the next morning noticed the gruesome passenger and called the police. Officers found Hutcherson inside of his home, still wearing his bloody clothes from the night before. He was arrested and charged with vehicular homicide and driving under the influence. Here's another freaky car-related death, and probably one of the most famous ones in history. Isidora Duncan was an American dancer who gained popularity in the early 20th century and revolutionized the field of contemporary dance. She was a little too weird for America at the time, so in 1898 she moved to Europe, where she spent some time teaching in Moscow and became popular in the bohemian art scenes of Paris and London. And like so many celebrities, Isidora was known for her signature accessory, a long, flowing silk scarf that she wore everywhere. It was elegant, dramatic, and ultimately deadly. In 1927, she was visiting friends with Benoit Falchetto, a French mechanic that she was romantically involved with. As they were leaving, Duncan's friend Mary Desty urged her to wear a cape. It was chilly outside, but Duncan waved her off. She would only wear her scarf. This would prove to be her doom. She climbed into Falchetto's open-top car, her scarf still trailing loosely behind her. Moments later, the car pulled forward, and tragedy struck. The end of the scarf was caught in the exposed spokes of the rear wheel, yanking Duncan out of the car by her neck with enough force to break it. This accident was big news when it happened, and it led to contemporary writer Gertrude Stein remarking that affectations can be dangerous. You shouldn't try everything you see on TV. Obviously, that goes for big things like jumping off buildings and driving your car through big, conveniently placed panes of glass. But it also goes for little stupid things too, like how, for example, in 2013, a man died from an atomic wedgie. This classic tactic of cartoon bullies involves pulling the waistband of someone's underpants up over their head. It may sound impossible, but it is how Bradley Davis of Oklahoma in the USA killed his stepfather, Denver Lee St. Clair. The two had been fighting, and after Davis knocked St. Clair down, he pulled the elastic of St. Clair's ripped underpants up over his head. The elastic pressed down on his throat, and it ended up strangling him to death. Even though Davis tried to plead self-defense, he was sentenced to first-degree murder when prosecutors found that Davis had taken cell phone photos of his dying stepfather. Investigators also said that St. Clair had sustained head wounds, which would have killed him if the wedgie hadn't killed him first. History is full of stories of inventors who were killed by their own inventions, but what about artists killed by their own artwork? That's just what happened to Luis Gimenez, an American sculptor from New Mexico. In 1992, Gimenez was commissioned to create an art piece for the Denver International Airport. He decided to make the sculpture a horse. It was an homage to the early days of long-distance travel in America, and as a tribute to his own horse, a blue roan Appaloosa named Blackjack. He made several scale models before starting the final piece, but due to health complications, it took until 2006 for Gimenez to make real progress. The final statue was going to have LED floodlights embedded in the eyes, and it would be 32 feet tall, so big that it had to be constructed in sections before being put together. It was while working on one of these sections that the sculpture would come loose and fall on top of Gimenez, badly cutting his leg in the process. He tragically died of blood loss and was pronounced dead on arrival at the local hospital. Gimenez had only completed the horse's head at the time of his death, and after much deliberating, Gimenez's family, his assistants, and fellow painters, Camilo Nunez and Richard Lovato, completed the other two sections. This meant that the horse could still be assembled and shipped to Denver. The statue, the Blue Mustang, is still there to this day. Locals have given it the nickname Blucifer due to both its ominous glowing eyes and a reputation for cold-blooded murder. But it's still a lot less embarrassing than our next weird death. James William Hesseldon was an English entrepreneur who, after losing his job in the miners' strikes of the 1980s, made a fortune off the Hesco Bastion. It was a collapsible building material that he patented, which is used to build floor barriers, as well as by soldiers to quickly build fortifications. Though his invention earned him an OBE in 2006, most people today remember James Hesseldon for being a man who was killed by a Segway a mere 9 months after he bought the Segway company. Hesseldon bought the company on Christmas of 2009 because when you're rich, you can just buy a company as a Christmas present for yourself. Then in September 2010, not even a full year later, he was riding his Segway with his dog around his hometown of Thorpe Arch. He reversed off the path and let a fellow dog walker get by him, but the Segway rolled backwards and he fell off a nearby cliff into the river wharf. Not quite as dramatic as an artist being killed by his own sculpture, but still, the weirdly ironic timing definitely makes this death stand out. Another man tragically killed by his own creation was Giacomo Chiapparini of Rio de Lombardia in Italy. In 2023, the 74-year-old dairy boss was crushed to death when a shelf in his warehouse broke. It caused a domino effect that led to Chiapparini being buried under thousands of wheels of Grana Padano cheese. Each wheel of this hard Parmesan-like cheese weighed about 84 pounds. The wheels were so big and there were so many of them, the witnesses said the collapse sounded like thunder, and it took firefighters 12 hours to recover Chiapparini's body. At least he died doing what he loved. It'd be a pretty cruel irony if he was lactose intolerant. Staying in Italy, here's another person who died doing what they loved. Giulia Manfrini, a travel agency owner and competitive surfer from Turin, who died in 2024. Manfrini was well known in the Italian surfing community and was also an accomplished snowboarder, having competed in the 2009 Winter Universidad in China. She tragically passed away at the age of 36 while on vacation in Masukut Island in Indonesia. She had been out surfing when a crocodile needlefish, a type of fish with a long pointed snout similar to a swordfish, impaled her through the chest. Here's another weird animal death from Indonesia. Giant man-eating snakes are one of the things that movies and video games convince us to fear, probably way more than we probably need to. Sure, some types of snakes can get pretty big, but big enough to take down a fully grown human? That sounds like pure Hollywood fiction. Except, well, sometimes it's not. In 2017, 25-year-old Akbar Salubrio of Sulawesi, Indonesia, was reported missing on March 25th. One day later, the search party discovered a very fat reticulated python in Salubrio's backyard. Fearing the worst, they cut the snake open, and sure enough, the snake had human remains in its belly which were a DNA match to the missing man. This was the first ever scientifically documented case of a snake eating a fully grown person, and weirdly enough, it hasn't been the last. Since 2017, 4 more missing people from in and around Sulawesi have been found inside the bellies of reticulated pythons. Clearly, either there's some radioactive meteor in the area making extra-large killer snakes, or the snakes have always been able to do this and something happened in 2017 that made them all just decide they had had enough. Either way, if you're planning a trip to Sulawesi anytime soon, be sure to watch where you step. Soccer can be a pretty serious sport, and there are a lot of people who pray for their team to win. We can't say whether or not it's ever helped, but for supporters of Basanga Football Club in 1998, it sure must have looked like God was acting in their favor. The African soccer team were drawing 1-1 in a match against Benet Tshadi FC and Kasai Democratic Republic of Congo. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning hit the field, instantly killing 11 people and injuring a further 30. Strangely enough, though, none of the dead or wounded were Basanga players. This event was so suspicious, in fact, that it led to serious public debate across the country over the potential use of witchcraft in professional sports. There's a theory that the reason the Basanga players survived was due to having rubber cleats in their boots, while the Benet Tshadi players had metal ones. But that doesn't hold too much weight, since electricity can travel through air at close range, and it doesn't matter what kind of shoes you're wearing. Nobody can say for sure what the truth is, though. A civil war broke out in the Congo not too long after this mysterious event, and as a result, a lot of official government documents have been lost or damaged. Staying in the world of sports, let's talk about the only time a fan has ever died attending an NHL hockey match. Brittany Nicole Cecil was a 13-year-old hockey fan from Columbus, Ohio. In 2002, she went with her dad to see the Columbus Blue Jackets play the Calgary Flames at the Nationwide Arena. In the last 12 minutes of the game, an errant hockey puck was hit out of the rink and over the protective glass barrier where it hit Brittany in the temple. This didn't kill her instantly, and she was able to walk to a first aid station before being taken by ambulance to the local children's hospital. Though she suffered an initial seizure and was kept overnight, she seemed fine the next day and was allowed to leave. However, the doctors had failed to catch a torn artery in her brain, and soon enough, she suffered a high fever, lost consciousness, and died. To make this even more tragic, this all happened 2 days before her birthday. Whether it's the PS5 or the Switch 2, it seems like with every new console release, people try more and more crazy things to get their hands on one. But in early 2007, not long after the Wii's release, one Nintendo fan from Sacramento named Jennifer Strange actually died trying to get her hands on one. The 28-year-old mom entered a contest hosted by her local radio station, KD&D, called Hold Your Wii for a Wii. It was exactly what it sounded like. Contestants had to drink as much water as they could, and whoever went the longest without needing to go to the toilet would go home with a shiny new Nintendo Wii. Stay classy, Sacramento. During the competition, Strange complained of a pain in her stomach and threw up, but for her trouble she did manage to net the second-place prize, which were concert tickets. After what must have been a humiliating experience, she went home, called in sick from work due to a severe headache, and died soon after. Her cause of death was water intoxication, which, yes, you can die from. Strange's family successfully sued the radio station, claiming the contestants hadn't properly been made aware of the potential risks of drinking too much water. Next, here's a case where 7 minutes in heaven ended up actually sending someone to the great beyond. In 2017, after coming home from his girlfriend's house, a Mexican teenager named Julio Macias Gonzalez suffered convulsions at the dinner table. His family quickly called an ambulance, but paramedics were unable to save Julio's life. The cause of death? A stroke. It was brought on by a hickey that his girlfriend had left on his neck when they had been together earlier in the day. The suction from her love bite had caused a blood clot to form in his neck, which traveled into his brain and killed him. In an even more extreme case of killer love bites, in 2001, a German man by the name of Bernd Brandes was butchered and eaten by Armin Meiwes, who he had met on a forum for people with extreme fetishes. The weirdest thing about Brandes' death was that he had given total consent to his killer. Meiwes had a fetish for cannibalism since he was a young boy, and by 2001 he had trawled all kinds of fetish communities for someone who would let him chow down. Brandes, on the other hand, had a castration fetish, so the pair came to a compromise. Brandes would let Meiwes cut off his member so Meiwes could eat it. Sadly, Meiwes would kill Brandes the next morning. Over the course of the next year, Meiwes would consume 44 pounds of Brandes' flesh, which he stored in the freezer next to some takeaway pizza. Meiwes was arrested in December 2002 and was charged with murder despite the fact that his victim asked to be killed. In 2003, Dr. Hitoshi Nakaido, a surgical resident at Christius St. Joseph Hospital in Houston, Texas, was killed by a malfunctioning elevator. As he was rushing to get on before the doors closed, they closed on the top of his head. The other person on the elevator, Karen Steinow, tried to push the emergency stop, but the elevator had already started rising, and in the process, it sliced off the top of Dr. Nakaido's head. The cause of the accident was determined to be faulty wiring in the motion sensors, which usually keep elevators from closing when someone moves between them. The freakiest part of this story is that the elevator did eventually stop between the 4th and 5th floors, and this meant that Steinow was trapped in the elevator with the severed top half of her colleague's head until the fire department saved her. Staying on the topic of elevators, in 2013 a video went viral showing a woman behaving in a strange, paranoid manner in an elevator at an infamous Los Angeles hotel. The person in the video was Elisa Lam, a Canadian college student who at the time had been missing for a few weeks and was last seen at the Cecil Hotel. But despite the video's popularity, it didn't result in any significant leads in the search for Elisa. Nobody knew where she was, until the residents of the Cecil started complaining about low water pressure in the taps. When maintenance checked the tank, they found Elisa Lam's body floating in the water. This discovery, combined with the video, led many people online to theorize that she must have been murdered. However, her autopsy revealed that there was no evidence of assault or foul play. Tragically, it seems that Elisa Lam had stopped taking her medication and suffered a psychotic break, during which she climbed onto the roof of the hotel and into the water tank, where she slipped on the ladder and drowned. Lam's parents have filed a wrongful death suit against the hotel, but the suit was dismissed after the hotel claimed that it was still unclear how Lam was able to open the water tank by herself. This next death is what happens when you take the phrase "dance your heart out" literally. Dietrich von Holstein-Heisler, a high-ranking infantry general in the German Empire and aide-de-camp to Kaiser Wilhelm II, met his end in one of the strangest ways imaginable. In 1908, the Kaiser's entourage was staying at the Donau-Eschingen Castle in the Black Forest for a royal hunting trip. After dinner one evening, the group decided to lighten the mood by putting on a drag show for Kaiser Wilhelm's entertainment. And the star of the show was Holstein-Heisler. He was dressed in a pink ballerina tutu and a flower crown and performed a show-stopping dance featuring pirouettes, jumps, and lots of flirting with the audience. But keep in mind, even though he was a military man, Holstein-Heisler was 56, so his heart wasn't used to serving that level of charisma, uniqueness, nerve, or talent. So when the Kaiser's entourage started clapping and cheering, Holstein-Heisler took a bow and promptly collapsed from a heart attack. This death may be the only recorded case in the history of a death drop where the performer literally dropped dead. Now, from the past to the future, the ice cream of the future, that is. In 2018, 77-year-old Hildegard Whitting of Tacoma, Washington, was killed by dry ice. Her son delivered Dippin' Dots for a living, and he used his own car to make the deliveries. To keep the dots cool, he came up with the idea of packing the back of his car with dry ice. One night, Whitting was visiting her son and his wife when her daughter-in-law offered to drive her home at 11 p.m., blissfully unaware that the dry ice was still in the back of the car. Now, for those who don't know, the fumes that come off of dry ice are concentrated carbon dioxide. So while Whitting's daughter was driving her home, the car filled up with fumes and both women fell unconscious. While her daughter-in-law was taken to the hospital, Hildegard Whitting was unfortunately asphyxiated before she could be rescued. It doesn't matter how you go out, when your time is up, it's up. But that hasn't stopped some people from trying to cheat the system. Watch insane ways people have faked their own death to see just how far they'll go to disappear.